Strategic reserves are happening everywhere. We recently had Arizona say that they wanted a strategic reserve. The governor signed it into law. This is something which is happening across many states. Likely, this is why we're seeing a rise in the price of Bitcoin. We're banging on the door of 100K. A few weeks ago, we said the bull run had already started. Many are saying that this is going to usher the era in of where we start to see rapid accumulation or rapid rise in price as more states and other major actors start acquiring more Bitcoin. Lucas, how close have you been keeping up on this? I know that this was something that we were anticipating would happen, and it did. What's your thoughts here?
I've had a long time expectation that states were going to be looking for an alternative to the United States dollar. So in that regard, I've long expected for states to be making moves towards gold, towards Bitcoin, towards having some other basis of determining, what the value of for establishing a currency that's separate from the dollar. So I think that's actually what's at stake here. When talk began back in the presidential election, Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming was talking about Bitcoin strategic reserve. That was picked up at the national level. I don't know what difference it makes at the national level, but it makes a huge difference for states. So I'm not surprised at this at all. I think this has the timing of this is in part a greater understanding and acceptance of crypto, but it's also an understanding that the Federal Reserve just purchased $34 billion worth of United States treasuries. And people are beginning to understand the shell game that's going on there. So I think that's more broadly what's at stake here.
And the federal government has had the ability to influence states through funding. And this was something that we were kind of toying with the idea of in a recent conversation, where if the federal government loses its ability to influence states by giving them money because they start to stand on their own 2 feet, they start to have things that are alternatives to the dollar, ways that they can interact with the broader economy in a way that's disconnected from the US dollar, that weakens the power of the federal government and actually might embolden or empower the states to do things that they maybe heretofore hadn't anticipated being able to do.
Absolutely. And this is something that nobody ever talks about whenever we have all these narratives and starting points of when things begin to go wrong with the United States, with the power of the federal government. But I think turning back to the creation of the greenback, the federal dollar in 1862 and 1863. And then what followed on the backs of that was the creation of the national banking system. And many might poo-poo that and say, "Oh, that's just that's just politics." There were still state banks, and state banks were reformed. The federal government taxed the state banks to the point that that desecrated 90% of them, and devastated them. I should say, desecrate, devastate, certainly not decimate. And then state bank charters, whenever they came back in, I believe, the 1870s, they were under the thumb of FDIC. Well, FDIC didn't come around till later. But long story short, the states used to have much more power when it came to where money came from. And the fight at Washington used to be about the monopolies of the various states. So that was part of the conflict that led into the Civil War. But long story short, it has not always been the case that the federal government had the power to to influence the decisions of states. And you think about, I mean, it's truly the denial of funding that is the power of the government and what threatens politicians. And you also think about all of these politicians who go to office at the local and state levels, and their job, and they talk about budgets, and they talk about not raising taxes, and how they're going to limit the size of government. But then when they get into office, they find that they need cash, that they have budget deficits, that at least the government employees, and the expectations of some is that costs are going up the next year, and that salaries for their employees have to go up to compete with especially federal employees, and they become addicted to, rather than raising taxes, reaching out to the federal government. And the federal government, who the U.S. Treasury can create IOUs, U.S. Treasury bonds and bills and notes, and turn around and sell those to the Federal Reserve. They have a magical cash creating machine, and so they turn around and give all that money back out to the states. So this is the true problem at the heart of what's wrong with politics and the flows of power in America. So I'm
I'll be
very
interested. I'll be interested to see with these strategic reserves if we start to see any sort of flip flopping. Because one thing that we've seen with the Trump administration is they're working to dismantle a lot of stuff that was put in place under the Biden administration. So they look at various policies, things that were enacted, and circumventing or undoing things that happened during that administration. So oftentimes we'll see this when the Democrats are in office, they'll put into place a whole bunch of policies and make a bunch of decisions. And then if they lose power and the Republicans take over, then they'll undo all of that and switch it around. And one of the things that I think famously was happening at the federal level was they had intended to sell off the Bitcoin that they had seized during, I think it was the Silk Road seizure. And as soon as Trump came into office, I believe that that was shut down and they decided not to do that. So I wonder if in these various states, Arizona, New Hampshire, any of these other states that end up with these strategic reserves, if this ends up being viewed as a Republican initiative, that this is something that was done under the Republican administration, it's viewed as something that is undesirable by the Democrats, or whether it'll be embraced by both parties, and that these strategic reserves will create kind of a rich state, poor state situation where those that bought into Bitcoin in these early days before Bitcoin really goes a lot higher, which BlackRock and a lot of other major players are predicting that they'll have purchased early enough that they'll suddenly be flush with cash, whereas states that didn't have a strategic reserve will be left behind.
Well, you're right. There is some tit for tat and policies that are changes in policies that are based on animosity towards the other party. But I think that's a lot of theater, and that actually also plays out with regards to disagreements over the reach of executive agencies. Um, I I I think that's less true with monetary and fiscal policy, and because I mean,
Well,
case in point.
we saw that in Germany. I mean, Germany sold off their Bitcoin holdings at what now seems to be a very foolish decision, and we called this out when it was happening that it looked like Germany was fumbling this bag that they were selling at before any sort of price increase, and they sold almost at the bottom of what was the beginning of this run up that we've seen recently.
Well, there's also a narrative that Canada was stupid for selling all of their gold, but I think what is at the end of this tunnel is an understanding that the value of any country's currency is going to be based on their economic output. And and ideally what we want to be getting to with states, you said there's going to be rich states and poor states. Well, there are rich states and poor states, and we have socialized the relationship between those states by sending money up to the federal government and then redistributing it. So this is part of the angst in America today. When we go back to states having some sort of independence from that federal monetary system, then we are going to see more difference between states. But I would say that instead of that being a bad thing, that will be ameliorated by liberty, by the movement of people in and out of states, people moving to states with a higher economic output and retiring to states that are a little bit more bucolic. Now, in the case of Germany and them selling their Bitcoin, I I hesitate to say that that it's a stupid move for any state because one, if Bitcoin is just accruing more dollars, and they see a problem with the world financial system in the future, and they're trying to isolate themselves, then it might not be such a bad move. And Germany loves to make things. They're having problems with their economic system now. They're having internal conflict with regards to what their relationship to the rest of Europe and to Russia is. But remember, going into the conflict in Ukraine in 2014, Germany had the highest GDP and the economic output in very real terms. I mean, Germany makes cars, Germany makes all sorts of things, but they require energy from Russia. So I think they uh, whenever they find a source of energy, then they will return to making things, and they will rely on their economic output rather than some financial asset.
I mean, certainly any strategic reserve will be dwarfed by the economic output or the ability of a state or a country to continue to make things participate in the economy as a whole. But under these hard money systems, and we've talked about this, where gold was the asset that was used as an account settlement mechanism by the banks, by big state actors and countries. Many are speculating that Bitcoin is taking its role in this sort of a settlement situation. And so having a big bag of these is being viewed as a very wise thing to have as we move forward into this being the state settlement mechanism of account. I guess in that scenario, having someone purchase some amount of these, if we do go through some rapid rise in price, uh, I think it's going to be viewed as a very smart move versus holding on to your strategic assets in something like dollars, which is how a lot of states right now are set up. Their rainy day funds are all held in US dollars. And there's no mistake for that, because like, why would you hold euros or something else if you can't use it to reasonably pay for things that you might need under a rainy day? But this idea that you would hold Bitcoin and that it's a strategic asset is a bet on this thing going up, and that it being a settlement of account, and that it continues to have real liquidity, that you can always sell these when you need to. And that's been one of the strengths of Bitcoin in what's been happening over the last few years. Whenever we see Bitcoin kind of rapidly go down, a good explanation for why it has this type of volatility is because Bitcoin is the asset that you can always sell when you need to sell it. And that sometimes means that the price can go down in shocking ways, but it also tends to hold a lot of value in the long term, because people hold it as an asset that holds value.
All good points, but I think in the case I think in the case of Germany, they're interested in things that they control, and even as I say that a good move, and I had expectations for states to be establishing some sort of reserve and beginning to build their own currency. I think all states need to be thinking about their exit off of anything that they're basing their currency on. And Germany is in a very special case, but let's not focus too much on them. I think we also need to think about the difference between states that have some sort of taxing base and a allegiance of people who work in that taxing base, and corporations that can move around the world. I think we are also, because I think it's a great idea for corporations to be grabbing some sort of bag of Bitcoin to give them options as to where they're going to land or operate out of. We just saw the federal government crack down on Apple and the store, and this might make Apple think about where they want to be based on in the world. Google recently was hauled in before the federal government, and that case is still being decided as to how they are going to be broken up and how their monopoly and well, some some of the things that they were doing with their ad sales are going to be going to be put under greater introspection and limited. So they might think about moving somewhere else, maybe not to Europe. Europe seems to have a lot of rules about what they think social media platforms and internet companies, tech companies, should have at their disposal. But there are other places in the world that might be very attracted to them. Maybe Qatar or the UAE or maybe somewhere in Asia, Singapore. And Bitcoin gives them a great deal of flexibility and an ability to plan how that move is going to look in the future also. So I think that states are beginning to think about debt. And going back to Germany, like, states, number one, need to be concerned about debt at this point, because as we have all of this fluctuation, as we have the Trump administration calling into question the fairness of world trade, the fairness for the citizens of certain countries, and also the fairness of the system that already exists, I think that we're going to see a tighter, I don't know, tighter liquidity and much more attention paid to both sides of trade agreements in the future.
I know that as we were looking broadly across a bunch of different states that were adopting the strategic reserves, I think almost overwhelmingly this has been the Republican administrations which have gravitated to this the most. I think one that's hot on the heels of this would probably be North Dakota. I think is contemplating setting up a strategic reserve. I really think this whole divide between the Democrats and the Republicans over whether Bitcoin is a political mechanism. I haven't seen a lot of Democrats really embracing crypto or Bitcoin particularly. Do you view this as like a divide between the two parties? Is this I mean, I'm just looking at the map and saying, okay, which states are contemplating this, on the cusp of adopting their own strategic reserves? It really does seem to be that this is a Republican-led initiative and has been embraced mostly by the liberty side, or the libertarian sort of leaning part of the Republican Party. I don't view Bitcoin as really being embraced by the far left of the Democrats, nor by the centrists. So I wonder if there really are any Democrats within the various states or even at the federal government that really have a desire to be hitched to the wagon of Bitcoin.
I do think that by and large, the supporters of crypto are Republican, and I think that has to do with with the relationship that the Republican Party has with the banking sector and the business sector, and they in some ways they're the Republican Party, we used to call it the Big Tent, and that Big Tent had libertarians and people who were interested in liberty and freedom, and also business people who were interested in free markets and laissez-faire rules for business. So the Democrats see crypto as an alliance and a tool of the banks and businesses. And listen to any Democrat, starting from Elizabeth Warren, and pick any afterwards, and they'll talk about the corruption and the old hat tricks of big financial players, and how crypto is an unholy alliance with politicians and those interests in the future. But again, as they begin to understand, because we know crypto well, we know there's a difference between crypto and blockchain, and of the positive aspects that blockchain brings, and that crypto gives us the ability to have faith in the transmission and the security of public blockchains. And so as Democrats begin to understand that and see crypto as a tool for recording the tax bases and the transactions within various taxing jurisdictions, it will be a much more powerful tool in their hands in the future. And we will see Republicans and those corporate interests more interested in crypto that looks something like digital gold, and will be interested in the mobility of that digital gold from jumping in and out of tax bases around the world. But the real power.
Look at this list, and the two that stand out to me, maybe that I wouldn't have anticipated being on a list where we say that there's a strong divide between the Democrats and the Republican states, are Ohio and Pennsylvania. But maybe that's because we're starting to see a shift in those states towards being more Republican dominated. Do any of the other ones stand out on the list to you? I mean, otherwise that looks like purely Republican states to me.
I mean, Ohio is the birthplace of the Republican Party.
But that's in a battleground state in almost every single election, right? It's always like, oh, who's going to win Ohio? That's one of the bellwethers of who wins the election. I think Biden carried it in the previous election, didn't he?
Well, and I think this also has to do with the relationship of labor, labor organizations, and some. I mean, when I look at Ohio and Pennsylvania, I think about their relationship with labor organizations. But the power of those labor organizations is failing, and again, that those labor organizations replaced the state governments. And the state governments used to be at odds with each other and trying to provide better working conditions and a more efficient and higher production of the resources. And those resources included the workers that were in their individual states. So I think that crypto and having crypto reserves, Bitcoin reserves, whatever they may be, are going to return us to an understanding of states that are based on some of those characteristics.
I'm going to walk that back. Ohio went for the Republicans in 2020 and 2024. That's a solid red state there. This to me looks like a completely partisan divide.
I mean, even Massachusetts, when you see Massachusetts on there, I think, one, that's a liberal state, but that's also where Mitt Romney's from. And that's also has very, very strong ties and relationships with the financial, the fire sector of the economy. So I think some of these notions of what's a red state and a blue state has, for the last 50 or 60 years, maybe even longer than that, been more about whether it was a had a majority urban or a majority rural population. But we have seen those lines of how people saw the world and wanted to see policy expressed in their government erode ever. I mean, from the 80s on, let's say Reagan on, um, those begin to make less and less sense. So I think we'll continue to see that erosion and the party. Some people call this the parties switching, but it's not the parties switching. It's the tools of government are very the tools of policy are very different with how money is made and how money is distributed. And if money is bound, if the creation of money is tied to agricultural production and the timeline of agricultural production, it has very different effects than if you can just magically create it and have a service economy um, uh, in distributing the money that's been created, and that's much more handy in urban areas. Think about the velocity of a dollar. How many times does a dollar change hand in a city? How many times does it change hand in a town of 1,000 people? It might lay under a mattress of a farmer in a town of 1,000 people for 40 years. And if you're living off of sales tax and other excise taxes, the the velocity of that dollar has a huge difference in an urban area than a rural area.
Yeah, and even thinking about the rural urban divide, that some of these states I think of as more traditionally urban and producing, but maybe that's also started to wane. And again, I would just look at Ohio and Pennsylvania as kind of the primary culprits here. There's a lot of very agricultural kind of rural states that are in this list, but those two stick out. Maybe Texas too. That's changed a lot, but a lot of these are less populated states. I'm going to look at the Dakotas and Utah and Wyoming. I mean, these are some of the least populous states that we've got, and they're glomming on to Bitcoin here because they're primarily red states, and this is what the Republicans have picked as one of their primary topics in the last 10 years.
Well, and going back to what we said about how the federal government exerts in its real influence over states is their dependency on the federal government for money. And you think about the velocity of a dollar and and how uh, urban states can get further ahead with passing money around. Rural states are behind. This is part of the reason that they are more disposed to jump onto Bitcoin Reserve. Now, laying all of that aside, there's something else that we need to be on the lookout for, and that is going to be stable coins. And we've seen actually Wyoming talk about a stable coin, but again, a stable coin, stable as compared to what? And if a stable coin is pegged to the federal dollar, then that is really going to put states in a bind as they have to inflate the supply of those stable coins to match that of the dollar, or to pass them around quickly enough if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to soak up some of the stable coins that are out in circulation. And if they're not circulating nearly as quickly as they do at the federal level, they're going to be in trouble. So this is why reserves. This is why reserves that are somewhat independent from the dollars that they hold. And I would say that we're going to see the next step in achieving some measure of independence from the dollar will be creating stable coins that are based on these reserves.
This this stable coin that Wyoming is establishing, I've never understood really what they're going after here. Like, is this like a currency that they're going to be using internally in the state of Wyoming, distributing somehow, using to pay taxes? I just this one doesn't make hardly any sense to me because as far as what I could tell and everything that I've read about it, this is a dollar asset backed stable coin where mostly this is a way to treasury uh, U.S. treasuries and U.S. dollars, and I don't know if they're intending to try to capitalize on some of what Tether and Circle have been doing with the way that they've been printing money by holding on to capital and being able to put it to use. If Wyoming views that as a game that they want to get into and try to knock that out. But I just can't imagine that people would prefer to hold WYST versus, holding some of the more accepted stable coins like, Tether or what, the rest of the currently circulating stable coins. I think it's going to be hard for these guys to get traction with this or to get anybody to use it in any meaningful way unless the state mandates it and starts using it on, I don't know, are they going to use it on EBT cards or debit cards or like what's the play here? I don't really understand this.
Well, it doesn't make sense, so don't feel bad in not understanding it. But I do applaud Wyoming for making moves towards stablecoin. I think they were excited about crypto, maybe didn't understand it in the full breadth of what would be ideal. This maybe is part of the problem of democratic republics is politicians see a new idea and don't understand how it's going to be, and they just say, well, let's start imagining um, what sort of structure or institution could begin to create this. But maybe they'll jump ahead whenever they understand some of these problems of if they're modeling or trying to be Tether or Circle. Again, they're going to have they're going to find out that there are problems whenever interest rates whenever they can't match the movement of the dollar. So, but
Well, I mean, this is the power of a state, though. A state can influence in exorbitant amount of influence over how people within that state, are operating. So if they say, well, this is going to be the thing that circulates, it's the thing that we're going to use to do, I don't know, some sorts of welfare or other types of government aid programs, and they're going to use that as the circulating mechanism. I could see where they could get some definite traction, at least within their own borders on this. But with such a low populous state, I'm not sure that this is going to be the most effective unless they have a lot of, circulation like you were talking about in a more urban type setting where dollars kind of change hands very often within, a limited populace versus very rural areas where money tends to have much lower velocity. If they could pull something like that off, this might make some sense. But even in their documentation and what they're saying about the stable coin, they're talking about international aspirations, DeFi. These things all seem very fanciful and not grounded in reality. Again, they're just competing against more well-known stable coins that have a lot more, I don't know, circulation, trust, and widespread adoption. Unless they can get this thing trading on a lot of exchanges and places where people tend to use stable coins, it's going to have to be very much within the state that makes it succeed.
well, and Wyoming has other problems too, which is there's a very independent nature in Wyoming. It's a large amount of ranching, agriculture, and also natural gas and oil over in Green. I can't remember Green River, I think it is. But imagine what happens when Alaska begins to think about the stable coin and also take a look at a crypto reserve and say, well, we don't need a crypto reserve. We already have our strategic oil reserve. And we could be having a great deal more power over Alaskans, and power that might those words might cause the hairs on some people's necks stand up, but um, Alaska Alaskans are already well used to the I don't know, socialistic distribution of the shared oil strategic reserve in Alaska to Alaskans.
That would make a lot more sense if somebody like Alaska made their own stable coin because they're generating cash already. And if they say, instead of taking this cash and directly putting it into the hands of people, we're going to put it into some sort of an investment, some way that we can, make a yield on this, if that's treasury bonds or whatever else it might be, and then allowing the circulation to happen in such a way that there are redemptions that occur over time. Now you're playing in the world of Starbucks. I mean, this is essentially the financialization of companies like Starbucks that are holding a substantial amount of treasury because they've issued these gift cards that are hanging out there for long periods of time. And whenever you can trap money in a system and it's not immediately all being spent, then you have an ability to make a substantial amount over time. So I'd say Alaska makes a lot more sense. I just don't understand how Wyoming can pull it off in the same way, because I don't see where they have that influx of money that they're generating on a routine basis that could be used to back a stable coin. It just seems like a very weird situation. But maybe if states that have this stronger disposition to socialize economic distributions like Alaska, that I'd be banging the cymbals if I saw Alaska do it.
Well, and Wyoming should not dismay and say, why aren't we Alaska and we need more oil? And because think about what this means for Wyoming beef and Wyoming wheat. Part of the problem in setting and maintaining agricultural prices has been going back to this lack of control that the states had over the production. And think also about maybe the history of Europe and how they have how we have words like champagne and asti and maybe bologna is not good, prosciutto, all of these agricultural products that are associated with a region. We also have in the United States the Capper-Volstead Acts, which sets up the rules for marketing and for commodities and monopolies in those the marketing for regional commodities. So I think we will also see in the future states beginning to understand and realize dedicated stablecoins that are tied to specific agricultural products. And I think that is going to have maybe the greatest be the greatest boon towards rural agricultural producing states.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time here. Fascinating discussion about how the strategic reserves of the various U.S. states will start to influence politics in the long term. We've got the Republican states mostly lining up to create these. Arizona is second. There are 13 others that are still on the bubble for making this happen. And as each one starts to get this across the line through their legislature, gets the governor to sign it, we'll start seeing these states then try to allocate some money into purchasing Bitcoin. And if that starts to happen with some furor, we could see a rise in Bitcoin pretty quickly over the next period. So keep an eye on these. We'll definitely stay abreast of any time new states are starting to look like they're either adopting it or on the bubble of adopting it. And we'll see where this.
All right. We'll see you next time.